Hello, this is Brian.
And this is Stephanie.
Welcome to the making and the remaking of a codependent mind.
We're going to talk about today the relationship tool of attention. Attention isn't a power tool, but it is a powerful tool. It's a tool that all of us have had in our toolbox since almost the moment we were born.
That's right. Yeah, it was kind of the only tool we have when we're babies, right?
Paying attention is how we learned. But we're going to talk about it particularly, obviously, in the context of building a strong and healthy relationship, the role the tool of attention can play in that. And as usual, we'll also cover the destructive uses of it, because we've said repeatedly, none of these tools in and of themselves are negative or positive. It's the way that they're used.
Right, either productively or destructively.
So just as a brief review, we're placing the kind of work that we do in our relationship into three categories: work of knowing and understanding, the work of maintaining the connection, and the work of strengthening the partnership.
And so we're considering attention to fall mostly into the maintaining of the connection part of the relationship work.
This is work that we do in order to feel close to each other so that we both feel loved, we both feel desired and cared for, we both feel valued.
And we both feel like we matter to the other person, that we're important.
So there's a couple of psychologists that I don't think we've discussed, but they're everywhere on the social medias. So maybe people have run across them themselves, John and Julie Gottman. And they've studied relationships and what has made healthy relationships for decades at this point. So they have a lot of interesting findings. One thing they talk about as being a feature of all relationships is people within those relationships, making bids for connection. That's what they call it. You make a bid for connection. And one study of their own that they cite is that they tracked newlyweds. So they recruited newlywed couples and then they tracked them for 6 years. And after 6 years, the ones who were still together responded to each other's bids for connection 86% of the time. And ones that got divorced only responded to each other's bids for connections 33% of the time, which is a pretty big gap.
Wow, yeah. And do they talk about what these bids are, how they look?
It can be anything from just a simple smile to a direct ask for advice or help. So it just runs the gamut. But, it's a bid for affection, for acknowledgement, for support, and also, of course, for attention.
Right. So two people can be in the same room for hours and really not be paying attention to each other at all. And that can really be felt. I know I remember that from the days of being completely disconnected from partners, how that felt to be in the same room with somebody and not feel connected at all.
So we might be in that situation and one of us might just simply look over and smile at each other. That's a bid for connection. And the Gottmans talk about 3 ways to react to bids for connection. You can, in their language, turn towards the bid. So that would be smile back, hug back, give a verbal response. Or you can ignore, or the worst one is you can turn away. You can actually do something negative. And again, they found that couples who stay together, they were choosing the turn towards 86% of the time. So attention, again, is one of the things that we make bids for, because it can help us feel close and that we matter, as you said. One of the very basic ones is when I speak, do you listen? When you speak, do I listen? So listening is an important way that we show attention to our partners.
Which really brings up an interesting topic in my head, which is this was a recurring theme of those 2 toxic relationships that we've talked about in this podcast a lot, where both of them would say that I never listened.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, and I remember at the time, of course, I took that as like, oh, there must be something wrong with me, because that's how I responded to everything.
So you took it on as you took on everything as being your fault, and
yes,
it was shameful behavior on your part. But I find it kind of interesting in 2 ways. The first way is the deep sense of entitlement that is expressed and was expressed in both of those relationships, but is expressed by expecting that you would be giving them your full attention whenever they wanted it, no matter what was happening.
Right. And that was always a feature of these bids. Their style of bids were really just entitlement bids.
Well, I think we want to be careful about using the word bids because a bid is an ask.
Oh, right. These aren't asks. Yeah, these are demands. Demands for attention.
Is that how they were expressed?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there were times, especially when I think about the really, really obvious express ones being, say, the second partner, Jay, the way she handled texting. Didn't matter where I was, what I was doing. If I didn't respond within seconds, she got extremely angry. So it goes from just a text of asking something or saying something, and if I don't respond immediately, then suddenly within, I don't know, a minute, there's all caps and 3 exclamation points, hello, just like this extreme, like, how dare you not respond to my text immediately? And I would sometimes, obviously, I would be in the middle of something. I was literally I don't have my phone. And so I get this and I come back to my phone and see these series of texts that just kind of got more and more irate over the course of, 5, 10, 15 minutes. And then, wow, okay. and then the accusations.
And there was also in-person examples.
Yes,
of that
right.
as well.
It was a similar thing in person also. Yeah. I mean, and this was both partners. Just as long as I was there, I was expected to be listening at all times, full attention. Yeah, which is different than just having the expectation of your partner wanting to pay attention to you.
That's why we use the word entitlement. And that's why it's not a bid. It's not a bid if it's a demand. No one is entitled to someone else's full attention.
Right. And this goes back to boundaries.
Absolutely.
Because my attention is mine, just like my emotions are mine and my physical body is mine. My attention is mine. And I can choose how to give that attention.
And we want to talk about the ways attention can be used as a tool for creating healthy, connected relationships, not as a tool to get what you want out of people.
That's the destructive use of the tool. That's controlling people. That's using people to get attention.
And feeling entitled to their attention for whatever reason. Even if you're sick, if you're anxious, if you're afraid, you are not entitled to people's attention. You have to make a bid, not a demand. So one thing, you never listen, again, expressive of this deep sense of entitlement because you listened a lot.
Yeah, I mean, especially during that relationship with Jay, where we've said before, she was this kind of verbal diarrhea style where she was pretty much talking constantly. And I was expected to be listening to all of that because there were tests.
But you would listen for hours. I mean, you've described, say, coming home at late at night, being tired and wanting to go to bed, but she, wanted to spend an hour or so talking about herself.
Just recounting the day. Like it was the unabridged version of her day.
So you did listen a lot, but for the most part, you weren't really, it's true, you weren't giving full attention.
Yeah, I wasn't absorbing this information. What I was doing was I was on threat alert. I didn't feel safe in these connections. And so I was constantly listening for things. That was mostly what I was doing. It was just like, what kind of expectations are in here? Because these were constantly being given to me, these expectations. And I knew that during these verbal dumps, there was always going to be some kind of expectation buried in there that I would find out about the next day that if I didn't remember correctly or do correctly. So the act of me sitting there listening meant that I was agreeing and absorbing and going to be following everything that I was hearing.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about attention and trauma, because I think a traumatized system has difficulty paying attention. I'm going to bring up Gabor Mate again, this physician that we've talked about quite a bit, who's really smart on trauma. And he has done some writing. I think there's a full book on ADD, which he himself has struggled with. And he draws a direct through line from trauma to ADD in that he sees tuning out and distractibility, which are characteristics of ADD, as a defense mechanism developed in response to early childhood trauma, which I think makes sense when we think about your experience.
Yes, I think that's exactly what it's divided attention for me. So, I mean, going all the way back to where I learned these behaviors, being the most obvious one, my dad's anger, and me learning how to respond to that.
So when your dad was angry, that was scary. That was emotionally painful. And you had limited ways to know how to absorb that. Yeah,
that's right. And then that became just my way of listening. I mean, it really, that's kind of where that started, that sort of trauma listening for me. Listening for cues of like, what is he on the verge of being set off? Like, what is it? What am I doing that may set him off?
And then if it turns out there's nothing you can do, if he's just venting at the TV or something, that's still, as you described it, that's still painful to be around.
Yes. So then really all I could do was just try to tune it out, was try to disassociate from it.
And that's, similar to then your friend G as well.
Right. Yeah. So with that friend, that elementary school friend that we've talked about too, G, that I reacted a similar way where I would see something coming or he would react a certain way that was just very, I'm panicked. There's nothing I can really do. So all I can do is really tune it out, pretend like it's not happening kind of.
So any of these painful emotions that came on, right? Like mainly being fear, but it can be other painful emotions as well. Shame, even like boredom or anxiety or confusion, any emotional pain, like tuning out or shutting down or distracting yourself is a reasonable solution when you're a small child.
Right. But that takes a lot of emotional focus to do that. I mean, it takes up a lot of resources when I'm doing that. I'm not really able to pay attention to much else.
You're in a threat response.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And the threat response, my go-tos would be mostly freeze. In the moment of this panic or fear, freeze would be just my default position.
I think that we can kind of see, yes, this tuning out or distractibility or shutting down as a freeze response or kind of as a flight response in some ways too. Like you can't get away physically in the moment, so you get away, you check out mentally.
Right, I'm going somewhere in my mind, going somewhere else in my mind, yeah. And then, of course, what we talked about before too, my other big one being fawning, more what I do to get out of the situation or what I do in between when I'm not being actively abused. But so this is what I'm also doing. So I'm checking out. Maybe 75% of my attention is directed towards checking out, towards the freeze, and 25% is directed towards listening for cues of how I'm going to then fawn. What am I going to do now to make this person stop and make them stop, try to make them continue to not behave that way going forward? So what am I listening for? They're angry for some reason. It must be my fault. It has to be my fault because what else? I felt powerless, so it had to be my fault. Like a dog listening for the word treat or something. Like I'm just listening for words that I need to know, need to hear.
When you're then in these later relationships, that listening pattern continues. Right.
So I carried that very much into those toxic relationships, the two abusive relationships. And that's the way I handled those conversations. So
that's the way you handled any conversation, really?
Yeah, most of the time. Right. I was kind of on a permanent, either on the verge of threat response or in full on threat response within those relationships. So I was either in it or I was prepared for it. And so anytime that a conversation started, kind of no matter what the conversation was, that was my focus, was listening for things. And sometimes, I could listen better than other times because sometimes the conversation wasn't quite so triggering. But then when it was, once again, now I'm 75 to 100% in freeze state, listening only for cues.
Those were not safe relationships.
No, not at all.
And I think we need to talk a little more about safety because all of these tools, if they're used in an unsafe work environment, then they're going to be destructive.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I don't know if we've said this enough during this season or maybe even during the podcast. If you are in an unsafe relationship, get out. Do not try to make it work. Do not try to pick up the tool of empathy or curiosity. Get out. And I'm not saying that to be dismissive. I understand that that's very difficult.
Yes, it's very difficult.
But it's an unsafe work environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you certainly do not want to pick up any power tools in an unsafe work environment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. That's where it gets destructive.
And it can be unsafe for a number of reasons. So we've said there are three entities. There's a me, there's a you, and there's an us. It doesn't have to be the case as it was with you and R and J, that these are abusive people. It could be that it's not a safe relationship because of the me. Like, it could be that one of the people is not ready to be in a relationship in that they cannot keep themselves safe. They don't know how to keep themselves safe. They don't know how to soothe themselves. They don't know how to maintain their boundaries. Mm-hmm. They don't know how to protect themselves. So pretty much every relationship, whether it's an abusive person or not, is going to have this unsafe feeling to them. And but it could be the other person as well, obviously. This could be the me, it could be the you, it could be the other person is not a safe person. As R and J were not safe people, regardless of what tools you used or how well you performed. There was never going to be a safe relationship. But it also just could be a combination. The combination is bad.
Right, sure.
The us level, like these two people together, for whatever reason, cannot create a safe relationship for themselves and for each other.
Yeah, whatever their disorders are, they just don't quite mix.
So when we're saying if it's not a safe relationship, get out, we're not encouraging the shame and blame game. You don't to get out, you don't have to take on some, I'm a terrible person, I'm deficient, and you don't have to blame the other person. It's just not safe. It's not safe. And, just bypass the shame and blame and just find a way to leave. So that's the safety warning.
Yes.
That should be attached to all of these tools.
Right.
Just to go back to, again, people with relational trauma, as you had, I think are going to struggle to pay attention because interpersonal relationships are the source of this initial wound, and being on threat alert is going to divert their attention.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about not being able to fully pay attention to say what they were saying because I'm listening for cues and all that. I'm not paying attention to myself either. I'm not really paying attention to what I'm feeling other than just I'm panicked. So I'm not asking, I'm not being curious about how I feel about this person. Do I feel safe?
Yeah, because you're doing what we all do. I mean, I think everyone's been in a situation or an interaction where they don't feel safe. And yes, our attention is given fully to keeping ourselves safe in that situation. So when you think of parents who yell and scream at their children, I mean, that's just a terrible way to communicate, in part because it's completely ineffective. I mean, that child is going to go on threat alert.
Yeah. They're listening to the yelling. They're not listening to the words, right?
And they're doing whatever they need to do to manage that feeling of unsafety, which is a terrible feeling to have. And they're not absorbing the information that they maybe even need to absorb. Like maybe legitimate information. They're not going to get it if it's being screamed at them.
Well, and another big thing that I can recall throughout my whole life, it wasn't even just about struggling to pay attention. It was also, I didn't like receiving attention. It made me very uncomfortable receiving attention. And I also just didn't know what to do with it most of the time. So either one moment I may be super excited that someone's paying attention to me, but then I go straight into some kind of fear or shame. Like, what's going to happen? Like the 5 minutes are going to pass and they're going to see how stupid I am or something, and I just can't. I had a really hard time handling receiving attentions.
Can certainly see how, again, people with relational trauma could have a problematic relationship to attention across the board. And thinking about your past specifically, I think we can say that in some ways you were attention starved, and in other ways you got too much attention. Yeah,
that's true, because I was going through a lot of things. Say during those elementary school years, I was being bullied. I was in an abusive relationship with that friend, and I felt alone in that. I didn't feel as though anyone was paying attention to me, being my family.
And I remember in the early episodes when I was saying, like, where are the adults? Like, who was paying attention?
Right.
I mean, that's their job, is to pay attention. And your parents never seemed to clue in. There were no teachers. Like, all these people whose role it was to pay attention to what was happening to you, and you just didn't get it.
Right. I mean, it wasn't just a matter, I couldn't have been that good of an actor. Right? It wasn't just a matter of not seeing the actual abuse taking place. It's the way I acted. I was very meek and didn't make eye contact and was just depressed without knowing what depression was, obviously.
And suicidally depressed as you got older.
Yeah,
and, And again, no attention was paid. But then, on the other side of it, you got a lot of negative attention.
Yes.
Both from your father, and sometimes from your mother, and certainly from G.
Right. So this tension, this people demanding my attention, I was afraid of that, because that is attention directed at me. Like, hey, you listen to me. So that made me scared, because I'm like, here come the expectations. Here come whatever it is. Well,
and I remember a story about your dad with flashcards.
Oh yeah, right. I'm not sure if we mentioned that. I think maybe I mentioned it briefly in the book. But yeah, flashcards. I think I was wondering if I somehow tie this to the fact that I'm terrible at addition, because I sort of have a panic when I see two basic numbers and I can't add them up, because I feel like I go straight into performance mode. And I think that came from this flashcards experience
And subtraction and multiplication.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like
right.
basically mental math.
Yeah. Mental math. Right. It's funny because it comes and goes. Like it all depends on, I can do it a lot better when there's no one sitting in the room, basically, which tells you a lot. Right. That was negative attention being directed at me. Hey, time for flashcards. And I knew that meant time for negative attention, time for frustration that I'm not getting it quickly enough.
And we should say, it's not like you didn't get any positive attention from your parents.
Oh, yeah.
You absolutely did.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Plenty.
But the negative attention stuck. And I mean, that's just a feature of our human psychology.
I mean, I think the positive attention stuck with me also because, I mean, I've said this before too. I think, even though there were unsafe elements of those relationships, my family and my parents, I felt safe. I actually did feel safe with them. I still do.
Most of the time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. Most of the time. So it's not reliable, but, somewhat safe.
So again, like we've said repeatedly, attention, there's nothing inherently good or bad about attention, but there's certainly bad attention and good attention, right? There's unwanted attention, there's negative attention, there's forced attention. And as you were saying, with your feelings of powerlessness, you didn't feel you got to choose. And what seemed like positive attention could at any moment turn into negative attention in your mind or in the way you reacted to people.
Right. Yeah. And I think just like the way I felt about myself played into that too. Just like kind of low self-esteem.
But even when we met and you don't really get any negative attention from me, you had trouble accepting positive attention from me.
I did.
It was obvious it made you anxious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Just you complimenting me anyway, like telling me that I'm handsome or something. Just like, okay. It's like I don't want to believe it.
Or you felt you couldn't, like it, because you had received that attention, say, in the form of love bombing.
It wasn't honest, or it wasn't genuine.
It was about manipulation and control and coercion. So you had been on the receiving end of what seemed like positive attention, what was disguised as positive attention, when really it was about, again, manipulation or guilt or control. So on your side, attention was largely used as a tool for threat management or for performance. Like, I'm performing correctly by giving them my attention, and then they're going to think that I'm a good boyfriend or a good husband. Or am I using it to manage threats, to perceive threats? And then in terms of your narcissistic partners, they use the tool of attention for coercion or control or manipulation, whether it was directed at you or other people. You saw them use the tool of attention towards other people for the same reason.
Yes.
So we want to kind of transition to then, how do you use the tool productively to build connection rather than for these other more destructive reasons? And going back to the Gottmans, I mean, I would recommend looking into their material and their research. Again, there's a lot of it on social media, and they have a website. They have
books also.
Yeah, and a number of good books. Long books. Yours is shorter. And they have a phrase that I used earlier that comes from them, is they talk about, again, turning towards. One thing is just to start noticing that, like noticing when your partner is making a bid and making a more conscious effort to turn towards them in that moment, whether that's, just even visually or physically or verbally engaging with them in the way that they're asking you to engage. This is what they found that successful couples did 86% of the time. So, it's not going to be possible all the time. We're going to miss each other's bids. But so paying attention at the basic level to the bids that are being made, and then responding with attention if that's what's asked for, or affection, etc.
Yeah, it's not always easy, right? Sometimes you have to be a little more explicit, right? Actually use language that actually be more obvious that you're making a bid. Maybe even say that you're making a bid for attention.
Yeah, for sure. This, especially if you're kind of one of these long-term couples that have fallen into the habit of not responding to each other's bids. Mm-hmm. Because I think that happens more easily early on, because the connection is more effortless early on. Early in the relationship, you're paying a lot of attention to each other all the time. Like everything you say, you're hanging on each other's words often. But absolutely, you fall into a habit of kind of tuning each other out. So it may be helpful to say, I'm making a bid here. I'm not just asking you to come look at this weird news article that I see. Like I'm making a bid for connection, right? I'm not just asking, do you want to go to the grocery store with me because I need help? Like this is a bid for connection, to make that explicit. And I think of Esther Perel, who we've also mentioned all the time. She says something about how complaints are often just disguised ways to express needs and desires. So if you think about someone saying, oh, you always work late, you're never home for dinner anymore, which sounds like a complaint, and maybe it is. I mean, the tone is complainy, but it may be an expression of a need or desire. It may be like, I miss you. I feel lonely. I want us to eat together, right? Which is then expressing a desire for you.
Right. So, I mean, this kind of makes me think that the way that the bid is made can be important in that aspect. Because, you know, if it is said like, oh, you never come home anymore or whatever, that's kind of putting the person on defensive.
Absolutely. This goes back to, it's a bid, not a demand, not a complaint. And the more you can, so it's not just about receiving bids. It's not just about paying attention. It's also about paying attention to yourself and making the bids in a respectful, loving way.
And knowing what it is you actually need when you're making the bid, rather than just kind of, you know, like going back to shame venting or something. Like, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I'm just blurting something out and hoping that you resolve it.
Making a bid is vulnerable. We talked about how even just receiving attention made you feel vulnerable. But asking for attention is going to be even more vulnerable.
Right. Because what if you don't respond to that bid?
So, of course, it's much easier, right, to just complain about the other person and say, well, the behavior is a problem. But if you can, again, reframe it to make sure that what you're doing is asking. And when we ask for something, we do so in a way that's respectful of the other person. Just to go back to the example of Jay demanding your response at any time, whether you're in the room with her or you're across the city doing something else. Like if she wants your attention, she demands it and escalates if it's not given. Like if I say something to you, if I make a bid for your attention, which could just be like, what are we having for dinner tonight? I need to do so in a respectful way if I expect to get attention back, which just means like I don't ask that if you're in a meeting at work, or if you're reading something, you're clearly engaged. I have to respectfully acknowledge that your attention is elsewhere. And if I want it to be directed at me, then I need to ask for it in a respectful way.
Right. Don't just start talking and expect the person to listen immediately.
And don't just text or call and expect the person to pick up or text back immediately.
And then there's a whole different brand of attention too that isn't just about responding to bids. There's also just paying attention to the person in general, tracking them, being interested in them.
Yes. And so attention, though, that is animated not in a reactionary way, right, by potential threat. Mm-hmm. So you certainly kept track of J and R.
Right.
You know, what are they doing? Where are they in the world?
Oh, God. Right. Yeah. Did. Well, yeah. If either of them were out, especially on a trip or something, but just out for the day, whatever. Yeah. It was like they were there, almost worse sometimes. I didn't have the relief of not being in the presence.
So your attention, you gave them a lot of attention for sure, but it was reactionary attention. It was about, like we're saying, threat management and performance. So this is what we're looking for: attention that is animated by desire and curiosity. I'm interested in you. You matter to me. So if you come home and you look sad, I want to notice that. And I want to ask you about that. I don't want to have to always wait for you to say, I'm feeling sad.
And just, what are you doing? What are you interested in these days? Like, how are you filling your days? How are you feeling physically? Things like that. Just have kind of a pulse on how you're doing, because you matter to me. And
then there's also paying attention to the relationship itself. People have to do that work. Is there something about the relationship that we're noticing? Like, have we not connected in a while? Have we not had sex in a while? Have we not
had a conversation about something important? Things don't just stay in stone forever. So just like, hey, let's revisit this thing we talked about 2 months ago. How are you feeling on?
So paying attention to what's happening in the relationship, like you would pay attention to what's happening with your partner, and giving attention to that relationship. So it's not a power tool, like we said, but it's almost kind of like a hammer, right? Like this sturdy little tool that you're going to pick up in a lot of situations, and it really works with the power tools, enhances them. So it works to enhance the effect of love, of curiosity, of empathy. It's kind of like a vehicle to deliver all of those things to your partner.
Looking at it that way. Right. Yeah.
We've all heard the phrase that, love has no limit. Like, we all have plenty of love to give, but attention is limited. It's a limited resource. So you do want to exercise some care in terms of how you distribute it and how you use it. If it's being consumed by one person, then it's a zero-sum game. You don't have it to give to another. And we kind of experienced this during this crossover period when your relationship with Jay was supposedly over, but hadn't really ended. And you certainly had more love and desire for me. But when she demanded your attention, you gave it to her. When there was a choice between giving your attention to the relationship in which there was love and desire and safety, or giving your attention to the relationship in which there was threat, you directed your attention to threat management.
Right. The threat won out. And there's another version of that too in the earlier days of a relationship, not, beyond that crossover, when I just kept diverting the attention to myself, even when you were expressly making a bid for connection, and it made me feel shame. And then I went into a shame spiral, and I'm not paying attention to you at all. And not only am I not paying attention to you, I'm making a demand for the attention to be on me, to manage my shame.
So this is one thing to be aware of, this dynamic in a relationship. And if you're in a relationship in which someone is demanding your attention, then no, that's not a stable relationship. And if someone is consistently asking you for it, in a respectful way even, and you don't feel animated to give it, you feel maybe reluctant or resentful, that's also not a relationship that's going to last. And also, if you yourself consistently make bids respectfully again, if you're not making bids respectfully, then the other person should leave you. But if you are consistently making bids respectfully, and they're not being met, then also not a relationship that's well constructed.
Right. It's a weak connection and it's a weak foundation. So that's how we use the tool of attention.
Well, as with all the tools, we practice at it. We take it seriously. We're trying to get better and better at it.
Thanks again for listening to this episode
and giving us your attention.
Giving us your attention.
It does make us feel good to get the attention of the listeners, and we appreciate it. We appreciate your time.
Yes, we do.
And any bid for connection that any of you choose to make with us, emails, codependentmind@gmail.com, or on social media. Brian always responds.
Yeah, please join us in a couple of weeks for another topic.